20 is where we'll be tonight. Genesis 20. Continuing on the story with Abraham. Of course, remember the series is the life of Abraham. So it was kind of tough for me, but I had to skip over the Sodom and Gomorrah. We left off with Abraham pleading for Sodom and Gomorrah, but in chapter 19, there's really nothing about Abraham other than at the very end, he looks over at the destruction. He looks down from the mountain and sees that going on, but that had to do more with Lot and Lot's family and just the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, not so much about Abraham. So we'll start with, I'll just read all 18 verses of chapter 20. If you're able to, why don't you stand up with me as I read this? And really, there's only one verse that I'm going to focus on, but keeping the story in mind from the life of Abraham, okay? Genesis chapter 20. And Abraham journeyed from thence toward the south country, and dwelt between Kadesh and Shur, and sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarai his wife, she is my sister. And sound familiar? He's done this before. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night, and said to him, Behold, thou art but a dead man, for the woman which thou hast taken, for she is a man's wife. But Abimelech had not come near her, and he said, Lord, wilt thou slay also a righteous nation? She said he not unto me, she is my sister, and she herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and innocency of my hands have I done this. And God said unto him in a dream, Yea, I know that thou didst this in the integrity of thy heart, for I also withheld thee from sinning against me. Therefore suffered I thee not to touch her. Now, therefore, restore the man his wife, for he is a prophet, and he shall pray for thee, that thou shalt live. And if thou restore her not, thou shalt, know that thou shalt surely die, thou and all that are thine. Therefore Abimelech rose early in the morning, and called all his servants, and told all these things in their ears. And the men were sore afraid. And then Abimelech called Abraham, and said unto him, What hast thou done unto us? And what have I offended thee, that thou hast brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? Thou hast done deeds unto me that ought not to be done. And Abimelech said unto Abraham, What sawest thou that thou hast done this thing? And Abraham said, Because I thought, surely the fear of God is not in this place, and they will slay me for my wife's sake. And yet indeed she is my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother. And she became my wife. And it came to pass, when God caused me to wander from my father's house, that I said unto her, This is thy kindness which thou shalt show unto me. At every place whither we shall come, say of me, He is my brother. And Abimelech took sheep and oxen and men servants and women servants, and gave them unto Abraham, and restored him Sarah his wife. And Abimelech said, Behold, my land is before thee, dwell where it pleaseth thee. And unto Sarah he said, Behold, I have given thy brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Behold, he is to thee a covering of the eyes, unto all that are with thee, and with all other. Thus she was reproved. So Abraham prayed unto God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife and his maidservants, and they bare children. For the Lord had fast closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. Lord, we ask your blessings on this message and on the word that we just read. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. All right, you can be seated. Interesting story case. Of course, Abraham's doing again what he already did once in Egypt to Pharaoh, and he's worried that these people are not going to have any fear of God, and they're going to come do this. Now, I think it's kind of strange that he still took Sarah, and she seems to have either willingly went with him or he forced her to go. And so, really, regardless of whether or not she was married, it doesn't seem like a very ethical thing to do, right? But here, it turns out there was a little bit of fear of the Lord, because He seems to claim that I would never do such a thing. If I would have known that she was a man's wife, and of course we've talked about this before with Sarah's beauty and how she's older in age, and some people look at this and think, well, how could she have been beautiful? But we've talked about the fact that we don't know how old Abimelech is. We don't know what culturally was a beautiful woman, and what God had done to preserve Sarah's beauty or any of those things. And so that's not really the main issue. But regardless, this woman was taken. Abraham, to me, when I see him doing this and then now doing it a second time, it says, man, this mighty man Abraham is not so mighty of a man at all. Like he's got this weakness here, a little bit of a fear as he goes into this land. But interesting, a couple chapters ago, what did he do whenever the kings had taken Lot, his nephew? He loaded up his guys, his soldiers, armed them, trained them, and they went and they got Lot. And now what was he going to do with his wife that they had just taken? This is a really strange thing to me, but nevertheless, it's what happened. It's happened twice now, and we see that later on it's going to happen with Jacob and Isaac and Rebekah. So anyway, as Sarah is restored to Abraham, and he gets the answer as to why he did this and everything. There's this one verse in this passage that I'm going to spend most of the time of the message talking about, and that is verse 16. Verse 16 says, "And unto Sarah he said, Behold, I have given thy brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Behold, he is to thee a covering of the eyes unto all that are with thee, and with all other, thus she was reproved." Okay, so this verse jumped out at me. It said Abraham, because what he's done, he's now being told that he is a covering. How does it say it? I want to make sure I read it right. He is to thee a covering of the eyes. So he is a covering of the eyes to Sarah. And I began to think about that and think about what that could mean. And I had all these ideas in my head. And then I said, well, I don't want to be way off base here, so let me see what some other people have said, and saw what a modern interpretation of that is, and therefore what modern translations say about this verse. And so, very interestingly, I looked up what do the modern translations say about this verse. Now, keep in mind, verse 16, make sure you know what it says. And Sarah said, unto Sarah, he, or Abimelech, said, Behold, I have given thy brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Behold, he is to thee a covering of the eyes unto all that are with thee, and with all other, thus she was reproved. Now, curiously, when I looked up modern versions to see how they translated this verse, it almost says the opposite in two places. Okay, now, there's a reason for that, and I'll maybe be able to explain that a little bit more. But when you first read that and compare it to the King James, it's like, what? They say two different things, like the opposite things, okay? So let me give you an example. The ESV, okay, that would be like today the most popular version that's sold among Christians, okay? Now, long term, obviously, throughout history, King James is still way higher, and there's a lot of statistics that put the King James above. But I can tell you for sure, if you go to a Christian bookstore, there's going to be a little bitty King James section and all these new versions. Now you could get King James in any other store, like Dollar Tree or anything like that. But the Christian bookstores, they're selling the moneymakers. Okay, and ESV says this, where it says, he is to thee a covering of the eyes. The ESV says, I gave him this money, right? And then it says, this is a sign of your vindication in the eyes of all. It's a sign of your vindication in the eyes of all. So it's like, well, Abraham is going to be a covering to your eyes. And then the modern translation says, like, this money is a covering of the eyes of, a sign of your vindication in the eyes of all. The NIV says, this is to cover the offense. It says nothing about Abraham being a covering of your eyes. He says, "This, 1,000 pieces of silver. This is to cover the offense." The New Living Translation says, um, "This is to settle any claim against me." Right. So none of those say anything about Abraham being a covering of her eyes. It just says that this money that I gave to Abraham is, which would make you think like, well, why would the King James translators write that? Like that seems like a weird thing to insert there. Where the King James translators just that ignorant when it came to translating. Which if you've ever studied the history of the King James translators, they were not ignorant men, and they're very uh, fluent in the languages and all that. So there's something else going on there, that's being interpreted. And I can't tell you what that is because I am definitely not a textual critic of any kind, and I'm not an expert on the Hebrew language. But I thought that was pretty interesting. And so then I looked at what about the second part where it says at the very end it says, "And thus she was reproved," because it's like, well, why would she get reproved? Especially if he's saying, "Hey, we gave him this money, and so now you're clear," okay? Because that's basically what they're trying to say. It's all settled now, and thus she was reproved. That seems like a weird word to use because reprove usually has to do with somebody's wrong about something, and so they're being told that they're wrong, and kind of sometimes even interchangeable with rebuke, which I'll talk about here in a minute. But the NIV, instead of saying she was reproved, the NIV says she was completely vindicated. The New Living Translation says, I guess, oh, I forgot the ESV. ESV says, "She's cleared before everyone, you are vindicated." I'm sorry, I'm messing up, okay? ESV says, "Before everyone, you are vindicated." The New Living Translation says, "Her reputation is cleared," instead of saying reproved. Now, nowhere else in the Bible that I'm aware of does the word reprove come anywhere close to saying, "Hey, you're vindicated." So this is a strange thing, and it just kind of puzzled me as I'm looking through this and thinking through, hey, there's got to be a message here. And I was prepared to preach a message about it, which I am preaching a message about it, but I'm thinking like, to me, it says something kind of neat there about Abraham. Um, but the modern translators seem to make this say something different. Like one says you're reproved, and the other says you're vindicated. Like that seems to be a little contradictory. It seems it's quite a bit different. Okay, so what I want to do is break this verse down a little bit, talk about the parts of it, and explain a little bit about what is going on. Okay, so first of all, the first part of 16 there says, and of course, Abimelech, it's talking about Abimelech. Abimelech said unto Sarah, he said, "Behold, I have given thy brother 1,000 pieces of silver." Now let's just stop right there. Is Abraham her brother? Well, this was the claim that they made, that Sarah is his sister and not his wife. Okay, so now Abraham says to Abimelech, he says, well, I mean, she is my sister. She's my half sister, right? She's my father's sister, my father's daughter, but not my mother's daughter. Okay, and so Abimelech, instead of just saying, "Hey, I gave 1,000 pieces of silver to your husband," he says, "To your brother," right? Because this is the whole thing that you were saying, and even if there's some truth there, he's your brother. He just wanted to bring that out, make it a point. And the thing about that is, go to Leviticus 18. Obviously, this is many years after Abraham, but this is in the Bible, so we want to look at this. Well, is it okay for him to marry his half sister? Well, here's what Leviticus 18 says. Look at verse 6. Of course, this is talking about all these different situations where you shouldn't be involved in. It says, "None of you shall approach to any that is near of kin to him to uncover their nakedness. I am the Lord. The nakedness of thy father or the nakedness of thy mother shalt thou not uncover. She is thy mother. Thou shalt not uncover her nakedness." The nakedness of thy father's wife shalt thou not uncover; it is thy father's nakedness. The nakedness of thy sister, the daughter of thy father, or daughter of thy mother, whether she be born at home or born abroad, even their nakedness thou shalt not uncover. The nakedness of thy son's daughter or thy daughter's daughter. So it goes on, but there in verse 9 it says very clearly that they should not uncover the nakedness, which means to look upon their nakedness, like in a married type relationship or whatever, or discover their nakedness. The Bible sometimes says they're not supposed to do that. And it says right there, with thy sister, the daughter of thy father, or the daughter of thy mother. So it doesn't have to be just the daughter, the full sister of your mother and your father, but even if it's just your mother's child or your father's child from a different relationship, you should not uncover their nakedness, right? It's near to kin. It's got it's your flesh and blood in there. Okay, so there are a couple thoughts about this. Okay, so here are some situations because Abraham's never scolded for this. He's never told like he did wrong by marrying his half sister. So there's a couple of schools of thought. Number one, maybe it was accepted before Leviticus. Maybe it wasn't a big deal um, that this happened. But then, whenever the law was given to Moses, it said, "All right, let's put this in the law. It's no longer going to be accepted." And there's some reasons that might be the case. I'll talk about one here in a minute. But another thought is that maybe it was wrong, but it just really it hadn't been dealt with yet. It hadn't been addressed, and so there was no rule about it to enforce. But it was wrong in God's eyes. But the third thinking is, and this kind of goes with the first one, that it was acceptable early on in history, and then later on, there was a reason that God said, "Okay, we're no longer going to tolerate this close to kin relationship." Now, the thing about that is, if you go all the way back to, I'm sure everybody in here is familiar with the age-old question, like where did Cain and Abel get their wives? Okay, I remember we did um, a skit one time for a vacation Bible school, and we had Adam and Eve, and they had Cain and Abel as children. They hadn't grown up yet, and Cain hadn't killed Abel, and there were some daughters, right? Because the Bible says they had sons and daughters. And so there were some daughters as well, and they were out. This is just a skit that we wrote. It's not Bible, okay? And they were out working, and they were having this conversation, and they were like, "Mom, where are we going to get our spouses from?" And they're like, "Well, you're going to have to marry your brothers." And they're like, "Ew." And so, but this is a reality. Like what had to have happened. It's the only logical explanation that the brothers and the sisters married each other. The only other explanation is that God just created them wives, like God created Eve for Adam. But the Bible doesn't indicate that. And then we see other places, like Abraham, for instance, where half sisters married, and so it seems like that would have been a somewhat common thing early on. Now, why is that not so? I mean, it might be repulsive to us because we know now, like we just don't do that. That's against nature. It seems like, or it's at least, if not against nature, it's against like rules that have been passed down, and particularly because we understand that when there is incest, when there's your DNA is too close to each other, then there's like deformities and there's like all these things. People start making fun of of these kind of situations and stuff like that. A lot of people pick on Alabama or Arkansas or something like that and talk about how they're all related, they're all brothers and sisters, and that truly goes on. And it goes on. Of course, famously known for this is like the kings in Europe. Some of the kings, and they marry close within the family, and they do that for a reason. But then it also creates a lot of health problems and all that. So one thought is that early on in history, it wasn't that big of a deal because they were so close to their perfect DNA that came from Adam and Eve that there weren't all these mutations and stuff like that. But then after some time, the the bodies weren't able to accept that. It would have been problems. So God wrote that law into place. It really doesn't matter. But what we do know is that nothing is said about that to Abraham. But when it gets to the law of Moses, it says, "Hey, this isn't okay." Right? So nobody can read that and be like, well, Abraham did it, so it's okay. No, that's too close to the that's too close of kin to be married, okay? And the Bible talks about this. But in this case, obviously, Abraham and Sarah were half brother and sister. Okay. Now, let's read the second part of that verse. So Abimelech again, he's already released. He's given Abraham all these gifts, and he's restored Sarah back to Abraham. But then he tells Sarah, "Behold, I have given thy brother 1,000 pieces of silver." The second part is, "Behold, he is to thee a covering of the eyes unto all that are with thee, and with all other." Okay, we'll save the last part, obviously, for the next point. Okay, so he is to thee a covering of the eyes. Now, what does this mean? Now, the other translations, as I said, are talking about how there is, a vindication. So the covering of the eyes, it would be like, um, it's covering the eyes so that we don't see this sin or something is what they're getting at. Okay, now when it comes to the word cover in the Bible, we already talked about uncovering nakedness and stuff like that. So obviously, there's a literal implication. You could be reading and saying like, "Don't uncover," like, So could he be saying Abraham is a cover, uh, of the eyes? Like, is there really something to like a veil? There are interpretations out there. There are some commentators that say like this is a reference to the practice in the Middle East. Now, as far as I know, this wasn't a practice among the Hebrews. This is a practice in the Arab world because Muslims today, to this day, really strict Muslims practice this, which is the ladies will, after they're married, they'll wear a veil that covers their eyes. And part of the reason for that is to signify that they're already married, and so therefore they're not looking around. They're not going to make eye contact with another guy, and that seems like a pretty, uh, strict, kind of like over the top law for women walking around and they can't even look at another guy in the eyes. I don't see anywhere in the Bible where it says that women need to do that, and so I really don't think that this was the case. Um, I suppose that could have been in Abimelech's culture, and so he's saying that, but I don't think it's literally talking about a veil over her eyes, especially when you read the context. It says that Abraham is a covering of the eyes to Sarah. I'm going to read it again. "Behold, he is to thee a covering of the eyes." But then it says, "Unto all that are with thee, and with all other." So is it then saying that Abraham is a covering of Sarah's eyes? Or he's a covering of the eyes to Sarah, but it's covering other people's eyes? You see what I'm saying? Like, this is another possibility of what it's talking about. Um, I find it hard to believe, again, that the King James translators would be so far off, that actually it just means that she's vindicated or cleared, and it doesn't have anything to do with eyes or covering or something like that. They obviously knew what the original words were that were used, so why did they put that there? What could the covering of the eyes mean? And I really feel like probably what I said, and maybe when I read this all at the end, it'll kind of give an explanation, but what it said about him being a covering of the eyes to her, meaning a covering of other people's eyes, you know what I mean? Not so much that covered her eyes, but covering of other people's eyes to her. So he's protecting her by not letting other people look at her. That's a possibility. I think that could be what it's meaning, because it goes on to say, "Unto all that are with thee, and with all others." So it's like whose eyes are being covered? Maybe everyone else's eyes are being covered from discovering Sarah's nakedness. Okay, now I think that's a possibility. And then when you couple that with this last line that says that she was reproved, that seems to say to me that she was, you know, acknowledging or being told that what she did was wrong, and that there, for some reason, that she needs to acknowledge that Abraham, was has um, this covering effect, right? Which I'll give my opinion on that here in a second. Now, interestingly, the New King James, where does the New King James fit in all this? Because the New King James claims to be closer to the King James, follows the same original text and everything, which it really doesn't. It kind of lines up with some of the newer ones as well. But most of the time, when there's these discrepancies, the New King James will be closer to the King James on this. Not in all areas, but in some of these areas it will. But the New King James goes too far the other direction, and it uses the word rebuke. Okay, it says, so thus she was rebuked. Well, rebuke and reprove aren't exactly the same thing. Now, they could be somewhat interchangeable, but remember that verse that says, preach the word. It says reprove, rebuke, and exhort. Okay, so in other words, you're telling somebody what they did was wrong. You're reproving them, and then rebuking is like a little bit more sharply. You know, what I mean, it has to do with a little bit more, not just telling them that what they did was wrong, but actually scolding them and dealing with that, and then exhorting. And so, like just what I'm showing you is that there are two different words. Rebuke seems to come off a lot stronger than reprove. Okay, and so in what way was she reproved? Here are some possible meanings. Number one, she is reproved for not covering her eyes, right? Because if you say, like, hey, you should have a veil on your eyes, so he's reproving her for not covering her eyes and making it known that she's married. Well, again, that doesn't quite make sense because it doesn't seem like they're talking about a veil. They're just talking about Abraham, covering the eyes. And so that's probably not what it means there. It also could mean that the matter was corrected. Okay, in other words, reproved means what? Somebody does something wrong and you correct it. You're reproving them, and so therefore it could be that this situation, this matter, was corrected in some form. He was not necessarily like rebuking her and cussing her out or something, but it was just settled. It was solved, which would be closer to what the modern translations say as far as like, what were the words that I used? Vindicated or whatever. But I don't think that word is close enough to what's going on here. I think that there was a reproving. It's like, hey, what you did was wrong. Let me clear this up. Let me explain what should be the case. And I think it's similar to the way, look at 1 Peter 4. 1 Peter 4 and verse 8. And above all things, have fervent charity among yourselves, for charity shall cover the multitude of sins. Okay? So it's kind of like it's taking care of them, not covering them like sweeping them under the rug and hiding them, but it is covering, it's taking care of it. And so I think that's what reprove means here as well, is it's kind of like taking care of this matter, all right? So here's what I feel like is being said, and then I'll try to make a quick application for us. But here's what's being said about Abraham. I believe that Sarah is being reproved because of the fact that she was involved in lying and saying, like, yeah, he's my brother. Okay? And as a result of that, she was almost violated, right? Why didn't she stop it? And as a result of that, this nation that was, I wouldn't say that they were innocent, although that's what Abimelech said, but this nation, they had not done anything wrong, and they were going to be judged real harshly because of this sin where Abimelech took Sarah, and it doesn't say that she was fighting and screaming and yelling. All it says is that she said, he's my brother. Okay, and so Abimelech says, okay, she's not married, and takes her. And so I do believe that she needed to be reproved for that. And I do think that Abimelech is essentially reproving her for that and taking, and correcting the situation. And so when he says, Abraham is unto thee a covering of the eyes to all these other people, I think that what he's saying is, Sarah, what you did was wrong. Abraham is a good man that's approved by God. He's just made that very clear. Like, he's a prophet and nobody should touch him, and God's got his back. And not only that, he's a mighty man. Now, like I said, we already saw a couple chapters ago where he's got all these resources and all this wealth and all these servants that are able to, and armed and trained in war. And they already fought this battle and they saved, Sodom and Gomorrah, which obviously God's now destroyed. But it wasn't that long ago that he had this power to do that, to rescue Lot. And it's almost like Abimelech is saying, like, hey, Abraham is got the power and the authority and the approval of God. He's a man of God, that he alone should be able to keep people from looking at his wife. So it's like he's, maybe saying, hey, like I everything's clear. I paid Abraham this 1,000 pieces of silver, but he's still rebuking her by saying, like, you have, you guys have lied to me and almost got me in big trouble. He said, look, Abraham is unto thee a covering of the eyes to all those to all those that are with you and others. Okay. Now I feel like what's being said, and if not, like, I could be wrong, but if not, here is the point. Like, hey, God is going to take care of you. And quite honestly, like in this particular situation, the natural thing to do would be for a guy to see, that a woman, like maybe this guy is single and he's checking out another woman. He doesn't know that she's married, all right? And then he's looking at her for a little bit, and then he looks up and he sees the husband looking right at him, right? This is a situation that plays out sometimes in the world. And he looks up and he realizes that that lady's husband is looking right at him, and acknowledges that he's been looking at at his wife. Guess what the natural reaction would be for the man to do? Maybe not physically covering his eyes, but it's like, oh, I can't look at her. She's spoken for, she's taken. And then I feel almost like there's some reassurance here for Sarah, saying, look, God's going to take care of you. Like you don't have, because really that's a terrible thing that Abraham's doing. Like, hey, just tell them that you're my sister, so that they can take you out and make you their wife, and then I get off scot-free. That's a weird thing to say. It's a terrible thing to say. And it's almost like the reproof is, hey, Abraham should be a covering of the eyes of all these people that look at you, because he's right with God. He's a powerful man. He's got his stuff together. He should be backing you up. And so basically, don't let this happen again, is what I feel like is being said. And so the application we can take from that lesson, if I'm right on that interpretation, and if not, it's still a good lesson. But our application that we should take is like, hey, trust God, and don't try to, cover things up, especially in a dishonest way or something like that. And be like, well, I know, yeah, sure, God has the power to get me out of this, but I don't think he's going to. So I'm going to take upon my own self to get out of the situation. What a weird thing. God's all powerful. He can take care of this situation. So live a life pleasing to God. Trust in God. Obviously, do all you can to protect yourself, but at the end of the day, you got to leave it in God's hand. But don't do something so crazy as to say, like, oh yeah, that's just my sister over there. You can have her to be your wife. What a weird thing Abraham did. He's the one that really should be reproved and rebuked for that. But I do believe that that's probably what's going on. I could be wrong. I'm not, like I said, a scholar in the Hebrew and everything. But then again, I don't trust modern versions to correct the King James and make them the King James translators so far off in the way that they translated that. I don't think that that's the case. I feel more likely that they were right and the modern translations are wrong. Okay, let's go to Lord in prayer. Father, thank you for your goodness to us. And I pray, Lord, that you help us just in faith, just walk in trust of you providing for us and taking care of us, and help us not to take matters in our own hand, to lie or to steal or to do anything to get ahead that you haven't approved of. And I pray, Lord, that you'll help us learn from this story and many other stories in the Bible that might help us to learn this lesson. And I pray you be glorified as we try to live honest and clean lives to bring you glory. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.